There is no reception tonight after the sermon, but there will be tomorrow night for the finish of the mission. And also tomorrow night, I will give the appropriate blessing to impart the plenary indulgence for those who have participated in the mission. There will be, after benediction this evening, the opportunity to venerate the relics of Blessed Solanus and Padre Pio, as there was last night, for those of you who didn't have that opportunity, or those of you who would like to do that again. And again, you're welcome to touch any sacramentals, rosaries, or other holy cards and things, those relics as well during the veneration. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, Amen. Have this mind in you that was also in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but rather he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of men, and known to be of human estate, with us that he humbled himself, obediently accepting even death on the cross. Because of this, God highly exalted him and bestowed upon him the name above every other name, so that in Jesus' name every knee shall bend in the heavens, and on the earth and under the earth, and every tongue proclaim to the glory of God the Father, Jesus Christ, Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. This very famous passage from Blessed Paul the Apostle to the Philippians in the 2nd chapter is a very ancient hymn from the early church, originally written in the Greek language, and given the title of the canonic hymn because of the word in Greek, kenosis, or to empty oneself. And in Latin, it is called the Carmen Christi. It is used particularly in the Lenten season, but at other times, especially during the recitation of the divine office. It is a very important hymn theologically, especially Christologically, the Christology, the study of Christ, theology of Christ, because it speaks to us about his very nature. That is, that God emptied himself to take on human appearance, and that he humbled himself further to pay a debt that he did not owe because we owed a debt that we could not pay. He died on the cross. And the historians and scholars believe that the Blessed Apostle added a line to the original hymn, death on the cross, that it wasn't part of the original hymn. Historians believe that the earliest Christians, when they gathered for the celebration of the Holy Mass, even in Jerusalem, would have used this as part of their Eucharistic celebration, this very famous hymn, and that this twofold debasement of God, this twofold humility of God, was in reverse in the twofold exaltation, that is, the resurrection. God raised him from the dead and then gave him this name above every other, from which we get the liturgical custom of the bowing of the head at the proper name of our Lord, especially during the Divine Liturgy. Now, this spirituality of the cross, biblically, is drawn in many ways from this type of idea. The most primitive way of thinking theologically about our Lord, about Christ, was a comparison between the disobedience of the first Adam, and as the Blessed Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:45, the second Adam, the new Adam, who reversed the curse. In classic Catholic art, many times you will see in a depiction of the crucifixion at the foot of the cross a skull. The skull is the head of Adam. And the idea is that disobedience brought death, and that our Lord on the cross brought life through obedience. And this is the earliest form of thinking theologically about our Lord himself. It is all through the writings of Blessed Paul the idea of that contrast between the disobedience of the first Adam and the obedience of the second Adam is all through the writings of St. Paul. Now, this was a very important analogy for St. Francis of Assisi. I told you on Sunday that G.K. Chesterton, when he became a Catholic, he applied his literary skill to the study of our two perhaps greatest saints, our greatest theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas, and perhaps the greatest mystic of the Church, St. Francis of Assisi. You can read Chesterton's beautiful biography of St. Francis even on the internet. That's not something you have to purchase. If you just do a search for G.K. Chesterton biography of St. Francis, you can read the whole thing for free. And one of the most beautiful biographies of St. Francis, I believe, that was ever written. And I mentioned also to you that Chesterton's reflection was that it was a paradox of history that every age was converted by the saint that most contradicted him. Now, I think that was particularly true of Aquinas and of Francis of Assisi in the 13th century. Because, as I mentioned to you before, that the 13th century was infamous for its lack of discipline among the clergy. And arising up in those years was a movement called the Cathars, or the Albigensians, depending on where they were. And they were rigorists. And they began searching the European countryside because they believed that clergy who were living immoral lives did not validly confect the Eucharist or any of the sacraments, and so thereby were depriving the faithful of access to grace through the sacraments. And they would make their own judgments, that would be their own subjective judgments about whether a member of the clergy was living an immoral life, and in not a few cases became not only the judge and jury, but the executioner of these clergy. The idea was they had to be taken out. And so it was into this world that St. Francis was born. And his conversion, which had nothing to do with the sins of others, but with his own sinful past. In fact, St. Francis never agreed to be ordained a priest. He reluctantly agreed to be ordained a deacon, but he didn't feel worthy of the priesthood because he had fought in battle, killed men in battle, and whatever other sins of his youth he felt loomed over him, he never felt worthy of the priesthood. And so St. Francis was a penitent, he said, first of all, for his own sins. And it was through the tremendous humility of St. Francis that even, it says, of those people around him who were not particularly virtuous, when they were around St. Francis of Assisi, they would actually start manifesting virtue because of his humility. He was very courageous. He went in the Fourth Crusade famously to preach to the Sultan, and he did not go to the Sultan to have religious dialogue, with all due respect. He went to convert the Sultan. And he was with the Christian armies, and they were on the field of battle. And he asked the general of the Christian army if he could cross the field of battle with a few of his followers to try and talk to convert the Sultan. And the Sultan had placed a golden ducat on the head of any Christian that his army brought to him. So, by doing so, he was taking his own life in his hand. The Christian general, knowing that, said to St. Francis that I give you permission only on the condition that you do not bring scandal to the faith, that is, that you apostatize or in any other way bring scandal to the Christian army. So he agreed, and he crossed the field of battle with his followers. And right in the middle of the field, they saw two sheep in the middle of the field. And St. Francis commented from Scripture, like lambs led to the slaughter. As soon as they had gotten to the other side, they should have had lost their heads immediately. But by a special grace of God, the Muslim armies escorted St. Francis into the Palace of Saladin. And once there, St. Francis did not attempt to have endless dialogue with the Sultan. He set about trying to convert him. He told him he was worshiping a false religion and that they were going to hell if they didn't convert. And that was the nature of the dialogue. And so he said, well, we'll set up a trial by fire to see which is the true religion. So St. Francis said, you set up a fire, and the imam and I will both walk through the fire. And whoever is burned up, that will be the sign that the religion is false. And so the imam said, no way. I'm not walking through that fire. And so St. Francis said, well, you light the fire, I'll walk through it by myself. If I'm burned up, then that doesn't mean, my religion means that I am a sinner and I've been burned up in the flames. But I will walk through, and if I survive, he said to the Sultan, then you have to convert. And the Sultan, fearing that he would survive, said, oh, no. And he said, but he kept St. Francis at court for some time. He should have killed him immediately, and he would have known that if he converted himself, that he himself would have died by Sharia law. But anyway, he kept him in court for some time, and he was enraptured by him and admired him. And so finally, when he wouldn't convert, St. Francis ended the dialogue and decided to leave, but not before the Sultan had offered him gold. And he said, I'm not here for money. He said, if you're not going to convert, I'm going home. So he left. But it was because of that encounter that later the Muslims would invite only one group of Christian clergy to staff the holy places once they were liberated, and they were the sons of St. Francis. And they have been there in the Holy Land ever since. God can do amazing things with humble souls. G.K. Chesterton was a sometime political commentarian, and in the 1930s, before he died in 1936, he commented on the political landscape of his own day, and he said, listen to this, he said, the whole world has divided itself politically between progressives and conservatives. Now this is the 1930s. He said the job of the progressives is to keep making mistakes. That the job of the conservatives is to keep mistakes from getting corrected. 1936. Chesterton said that he preferred the medieval model of social life, Christendom. Christ, not just at the center of our own personal spiritual life, but at the center of the culture. This model would become known as we know, distributism. It was a social model offered by Chesterton, but it was based on medieval Christendom. His point was that the more we move away as a culture from Christ at the center, the more divided and divisive we become. Chesterton, of course, could have been writing that yesterday. No? And so the medicine for every age, he said, was the saint that most contradicts it. The reason that I have brought the relics of St. Padre Pio and Blessed Solanus Casey, aside from the fact that I am a member of their order, talk about, the healing balm for our age. I told you that statistically, we lose 5 out of every 6 people from the Catholic Church. So for every 6 people that come into the Catholic Church in the United States, for every 1 person that comes in, 6 leave. And I was just looking on the news today, and there's a new study out about Catholics that attend the traditional Latin Mass, and it's a kind of like rocket science, that faithful Catholics are more faithful. The statistics are almost the opposite in the traditional Latin Mass communities in terms of participation, in terms of sacraments, in terms of Mass attendance. That's a beautiful thing. But statistically, we lose 80% of our young people in the Catholic Church in the United States before the age of 23. In a time of great growing secularism in the culture and in the world, we have a countersign in these 2 great saints. In the shrine in San Giovanni Rotondo in Italy, and Europe is becoming more and more secular, but there are 6 million visitors to the shrine every year. When Padre Pio died in 1968, there were 100,000 people at his Requiem Mass. Countless souls are still led to God because of this witness of this humble, stigmatized friar who died over almost 50 years ago. And Blessed Solanus Casey, who died in 1957, when he died at St. John's Hospital in the city of Detroit, there were 20,000 people at his funeral mass. At his beatification this past November in the city of Detroit at Ford Field, there were 72,000 souls present. And Archbishop Vigneron said that he could have filled that field 3 times for all the people that wanted to come to the Mass. They had to cut off registration for the Mass 3 months in advance of the Mass. I'm going to tell you why shortly. But the point is that we were hundreds of priests hearing thousands of confessions for several hours before the Mass. Countless souls who hadn't been to the sacrament, some of them in many, many years, some of them decades. There is something about the humble spirit of St. Francis and his 2 sons that is making itself prophetic in our own day and age. There was a famous story of St. Francis, one of the, we call it the little flowers, or the Fioreti of St. Francis, that he was walking through a town that had a priest who was an undisciplined individual, leading a lascivious life. And the townspeople dragged this poor soul out into the street as St. Francis was walking through the town. They knew what the Cathars and the Albigensians would do if they encountered such a priest. They wanted to see what St. Francis would do. And so St. Francis walked up to this poor wretch and knelt down in front of him and took his hands and kissed the palms of his hands as on the day of his ordination, and said, "Of this man's life I know not, but I do know this, that it is only from these hands that I receive the body and blood of our Lord." St. Francis knew that even if a priest was living an immoral life, he was going to hell faster than any layperson. But the point was that God used this man. This is before the Fourth Lateran Council, at which St. Francis was present, when the Church would solemnly declare that the sacraments were valid regardless of the moral state of the minister, that they worked ex operato. This is before that theological definition. But St. Francis' own intuition about that was made manifest in that little story. It is said that that priest converted that moment and led a holy life thereafter. Humility always calls the best out of people and brings conversion about in hearts. Bernard Francis Casey was born on a farm in Oak Hill, Wisconsin in 1870. He was the sixth of 16 children born to Irish immigrants to this country, and 2 of his siblings would die of a diphtheria outbreak when he was about 8 years old. He almost died of it himself, and it left his voice, his vocal cords broken the rest of his life. He spoke with a kind of high-pitched whisper the rest of his life. And as a young man, he had several odd jobs. He first was helping his family on the farm for a number of years. But then as a young man in his 20s, he worked as a hospital orderly. He was a prison guard at the Minnesota State Prison, where he famously guarded Cole Younger, who was a member of the Jesse James gang. It's said that Cole Younger and his brothers came to faith in Christ because of their pious young prison guard, Barney Casey. And Cole Younger gave Father Solanus his most cherished possession, a wooden footlocker that he had made himself. And Father Solanus had that footlocker in the monastery with him for the rest of his life. But his last odd job was that he worked as a streetcar operator in the city of Superior, Wisconsin. He was the youngest streetcar operator in that city. And along his route one day, he had to stop the streetcar because of a terrible, tragic scene on the tracks. And that was a drunken sailor standing with a bloody knife over a woman that he had just bludgeoned nearly to death, hurling curses and screaming at her. The scene so shocked his sensibilities that he realized that there was something more that he had to do with his life than drive a streetcar. So he went home, and like his brother Maurice before him, who had made a stab at the seminary, he wasn't able to stay because the seminary classes in those days were taught in German, and they were an Irish family, didn't speak the German language, and he kind of went home in defeat. But Barney decided to give it a try. He went to the same German seminary and was there for about a year or so, was having some of the same struggles, especially with the German language, and went home. A local priest recommended several religious orders, the Franciscans, the Jesuits, and several others, and then also the Capuchins, who were in the city of Detroit. He'd never heard of the Capuchins, but he decided to make a visit. And when he went to the city of Detroit, he was, I can tell you, unimpressed. He did not like the austere nature of the Capuchin rigorous life. He didn't like the beard that the Capuchins were required to wear by custom. And he went home confused about what he was to do with the rest of his life. He asked his mother and his sister to join him in a novena to Our Lady to pray for the future of his vocation, what he was supposed to do. And on the final day of the novena, he heard a voice clearly that said, "Go to Detroit." So he went back. And this time, he arrived on Christmas Eve. And the normal austerity of Capuchin monastery was replaced with the joy of the Christmas season, the beautiful carols in Latin and in German. And he said that he knew that he was home. And he would spend the remainder of his life with the Capuchins. He entered and was given the name of Solanus after Francis Solano, a 17th century Franciscan who played the violin, because Barney also played the violin poorly. And later in his life, when his hands were crippled by arthritis, and the friars of Detroit would say that his violin playing sounded like someone strangling a street cat, Father Solanus would go into the chapel and play his violin for our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament by himself, but he would often entertain the friars during recreation. As a young man, he struggled in school because also the friars in Detroit were from Germany, and the seminary classes were also taught in German. And it was not that he was unintelligent, but he struggled with the German language. So much so that toward the end of his time of formation, there was great consternation as to whether or not to ordain him at all. And Father Anthony, who was a scholar and from Germany and in charge of the students, saw in this young man a true piety and knew that he would be, as he said, a John Vianney for the people, a Curry of Ars for the people, simple as he was. You know, the story of St. John Vianney is a beautiful story, the Curry of Ars. He too struggled through school, and in fact, when he was ordained to the priesthood, he was ordained without the faculties to hear confessions or to preach. He was ordained just to say Mass. They didn't know what else to do with him. And because of the lack of vocations in France in that particular time after Revolution, there was great need out in the countryside for parish priests. And they thought, well, we can't do much harm out there. They sent him out to this little village of Ars. St. John Vianney went to every house in that village, learned everyone by name, invited them personally back to the church, would take time to hear their confessions, and was finally, because he was the parish priest, they reluctantly gave him permission to preach and to hear confession because he was their only priest. And he set himself to that task in a very diligent way. He was an excellent confessor and a very pious preacher. He drew crowds from all over, so much so that the neighboring clergy became jealous of him, and they started a petition drive to get rid of him. It's a true story. The petition, by accident, wound up on his desk. And you know what St. John Vianney did? He signed the petition. Get rid of me, I agree. That's the kind of humility that brings souls to God. My dear brothers and sisters, it's times, again, such as we live, that saints are made. That is the beauty of crisis. It's a time when new saints are born. But Father Anthony said that the young student Solanus would be like that, a Curry of Ars for the people. Indeed he was. He was finally ordained a simplex priest in 1904, again without the faculties to hear confessions and preach a sermon, neither of which Father Solanus did for more than 50 years of priesthood. And when he showed up in 1904 for his first assignment in Yonkers, New York at Sacred Heart Parish, it is said that the local superior guard did not know what to do with him, because here he had a priest who was not allowed to preach, and he was not allowed to hear confessions. And the story goes that he was sitting in the superior's office, and he didn't know what to assign him to do. And he said, "And you will," and the doorbell rang, "answer the door." And Father Solanus answered the door for the next 50 years, like no one else ever answered the door. He was the porter, the receptionist at the monastery. They gave him jobs that we normally gave our non-ordained lay members. He was in charge of the altar boys. He was the sacristan, so he had a little room off the chapel. And he would go into the chapel at night and pray for hours the old Capuchin way with his arms up in the air, extendis manibus, we used to call him, kneeling on the hardwood floor of the chapel for 5 and 6 and 8 hours, and just with his eyes staring at the Blessed Sacrament. In fact, the friars would walk past him and do this just to make sure he was still alive. And Father would be praying there in front of the chapel, in front of the Blessed Sacrament, kneeling on the hardwood floor. They'd find him in the morning often collapsed, laying on the boards, and And they'd say, "Father, can we please get you a pillow?" And he would tell them, "No, I slept on the soft part of the bones." Father had terrible eczema, which is a skin disease, and he developed severe rheumatoid arthritis all through his body. He was often fasting. He was just a very thin whip of a man. And he suffered tremendously physically. But he would always be patient with souls that would come to the door. He never rushed anyone away. And in the city of Detroit, there used to be lines out the monastery door on Elliott Street that you would think was the unemployment office. All the way down the street, every day. Because what happened was that God gave, through Father Solanus, a special grace. He was not allowed to hear confessions. For Padre Pio, the miracle work of his life was in the confessional and at the altar, mostly. But because Father Solanus was not to hear confessions, never gave a formal sermon, that God bestowed upon him a special grace of healing. Healing of biblical proportion. If you read James Neeram's biography that I brought with me, and I think most of them are gone already, or Brother Leo Wollenweber's, who was his secretary for many years and the vice postulator for Father Solanus' cause for many years. As you read through the sections in the book on the miracles, they're almost unbelievable. They have in the archives in Detroit a record of over 6,000 physical miracles associated with Father Solanus. The superior ordered him to keep track of the things that would happen in the porter's office. And Father was not a good record keeper, but he would scratch things down on the notepad, and those scratched notes fill 6 volumes of the archives, printed volumes that thin. Biblical proportion, broken backs, cancer, blindness, deafness. Women would bring sick and dying children in their arms from St. John's Hospital in Detroit to the monastery door, and they would be healed in front of Father Solanus. Father never, of course, took any credit for any of that. He said it was always the power of God. He said you have to have confidence to put God on the spot. You have to have enough confidence in it. He used to call it divine spot putting. And they said Father would tear up when he would see these things happen in front of him in Detroit. And what it was they were associated with the celebration of the Mass. When he would register people for Mass intentions to be said in the foreign missions, the Seraphic Mass Association. When he would register a person, these physical miracles would start to occur. Even people would call in because they couldn't travel to Detroit, and over the phone, there would be healings, for physical healings for people. His life was one miracle after the other. And Father used to say that you have to be grateful to God ahead of time. In other words, don't be challenging God. In other words, be grateful before you even receive a blessing. He used to say, thank God ahead of time. There's famous stories about Father Solanus. One of the most famous is the story when he was, because of his health, taken out to Huntington, Indiana in 1946 to live for the last 10 years of his life. There was a set of ties of beads that were kept out of the monastery there, which was an old Capuchin tradition. And on a particular occasion, a second queen got into the hive, and the bees were swarming. And so Father Solanus walked out there with his bare feet in his habit, no protection over his head, and walked up near the hive and started waving his arthritic fingers at the bees and trying to calm them down for about an hour. Finally, he goes into the monastery and takes a paper napkin out of the refectory, walks back out there again into this cloud of angry bees swarming, puts his hand out the second queen, wraps her in a paper napkin, and the bees all just calm down almost immediately. And Father Benedict Rochelle, who I knew well, who was a student at that time, said, I saw with my own eyes he pulling handfuls of bees out of the sleeve of his habit like this, and from around his neck, and not a sting on it. Not a sting on it. There's another story of a bee that got into the window well inside the monastery. A young friar saw Father Solanus lift the bee off of the sill and was sitting on his finger. And the young friar walked up to Father Solanus and said, how did you do that? And Father Solanus said, well, here, he put the bee on the young friar's finger and it stung him. Father Solanus had a calming effect on people's emotions. He had a healing effect not only on their bodies, but on their souls. It's because he became such a vessel of grace, a great priest, a great father figure, but even more than that, a mediator, what a priest should be. We see so many failures in the priesthood, but we see in this beautiful, simple soul. As one of the friars of Detroit said, the greatest man that this province has ever produced. This simple man who never preached a sermon. It wasn't exactly true, though, because Father Solanus every Wednesday would be the celebrant for a special service for the sick at St. Bonaventure's Monastery in Elliott Street, Detroit, and they would bring out the relic of the true cross, which is one of the reasons why I brought it with me for the mission. And he would pray over the people, but he would give an informal sermon. We called them fervorinos in those days, pious exhortation. The simplicity of the way he spoke about God drew countless souls to the monastery. Even a famous lecturer and professor of homiletics from St. John's Seminary in Detroit came to hear Father Solanus because of his reputation and was just struck by the simplicity, the piety with which he spoke, and drew constant souls constantly back to God. Father Solanus gave 5 points for growing in the spiritual life that he learned during his years in the seminary, and he maintained these throughout his life. And if we're going to grow in the spiritual life, I think that we can learn some things from these that Father Solanus would teach. He said, 1, detachment of oneself from earthly affections and have singleness of purpose in your life. That is, that the love of God and the salvation of souls is your primary concern. That your own needs and wants and satisfactions are always second to that primary goal. The intense, burning affection, love for God. That drives us, number 1. He said, meditation on the Passion. This is where the spirituality of the cross comes into his life. And you know, Father Solanus could have been, on a natural level, a bitter man. In fact, he probably had every right to be that. Father Michael Crosby, who was recently deceased from the Detroit province, wrote one of the biographies of Father Solanus. And he said, you know, he was Irish and by nature a fiery temper. But he was a man transformed by grace, because no one that ever met him ever saw that side of him. He was a man completely integrated, a man completely transformed by the grace of God. The way that the order treated him in those years, he could have been bitter, and he wasn't ever given permission to preach or hear confessions. When Father Solanus' superior died, after Father Solanus died, they were going through his files, and they found in his desk drawer one of the files that had the faculty for Father to preach and hear confessions, and he never gave them to him. And Father Benedict used to say, I would hate to be that superior on the day of judgment. But for whatever reason, after all those years, perhaps they felt that Father wouldn't even want to hear confessions or preach preach, but toward the end of his life, the bishop had given him, but he never received it. He was not a bitter man. He was a man of great simplicity and joy, and everyone who encountered him knew that. Meditation on the Passion was at the heart of his spirituality. And then thirdly, uniformity of your will with the divine will. To only want what God wants. Lord, not what I want, not my will, but your will be done. Always, in every moment of our life. Whatever our desires or our aspirations or our inspirations may be, that the question that we get back to all the time is, what is God's will? What does God want? Not what do I want. What does God want? That's the only way that we're going to find happiness. Mental prayer. When I tell you about Padre Pio in just a moment, and I'm going to end soon, this is a big point of Padre Pio's spiritual advice to his children, spiritual children as well. You know, the Capuchins from our Constitution 1536 were required to spend 2 hours a day in mental prayer in the chapel. And the 2 hours were for the week friars. Right? In other words, a robust friar would spend more than that. And certainly Father Solanus was much more robust, often spending countless hours in front of the Blessed Sacrament when he wasn't in the porter's office, patiently listening to people. Mental prayer and contemplation, a very important aspect, being able to listen, spend time to listen to God. And then fifthly, prayer itself, that not to make excuses for ourselves for not praying. He would say often, too, he added to others, raise your heart, he said, to God by frequent aspirations. You know, one of our old, beautiful Capuchin friars in Pittsburgh, who was a spiritual director for nuns for many, many years, used to teach the sisters that would come to him for direction to say simple prayer. So, sister, when you go out into take a walk in the day, look up and say, Jesus, for the blue sky, I love you. For the birds singing today, Jesus, I love you. Look into the face of your children and say, for the grace, God, of the gift of the life of this child that you've given to me, Jesus, I love you. Make spiritual aspirations over the simplest things that are gifts from God. Those are very important ways of learning to grow in the spiritual life. He said, make a good intention also at the beginning of each thing that you do, each work, and frequently during its execution, he said. Father Solanus was ordained on July 31st, 1904, and in 1957 he was taken to St. John's Hospital with a terrible skin disease on his legs called erysipelas, where the skin becomes almost translucent, blood red. And they were almost going to amputate his leg before it started to heal a bit. They left it intact. Well, the friars were going back and forth from the monastery to pray the rosary with Father Solanus and to await the end with him. But at the very moment of his death, there was only a nurse there with him at St. John's Hospital. And he had been kind of incoherent for several days, not speaking much. But on July 31st, 1957, the very hour and day of his first Mass, he sat up in the bed and clearly, in a clear voice, said, I give my soul to Jesus Christ. Lay back on the bed and gave his soul to God. Those words are emblazoned on a plaque above that room in St. John's Hospital to this day. They put Father Solanus in the monastery courtyard cemetery in 1957, and the first posthumous miracle of Father Solanus was of a woman who had a crippled child, and she missed the Mass, but when the grave was just newly covered, she took her crippled child and laid it on Father Solanus' grave and begged God through his intercession for that child. The child's limbs were healed on that grave. He was exhumed in 1987 to begin the cause of his beatification. My superior in Pittsburgh was there with our vicar because it coincided with the meeting of our superiors in the United States, the official exhumation. When they dug down into the ground to get his body, they found that the cement vault that his coffin was in was cracked and it was full of water. It was floating there for 30 years in water. And they expected to find nothing in there. He had been embalmed, but again in water all those years. When they opened it up, everything in the coffin was tattered, including his capuchin habit, but they said that he looked like he was sleeping. No eczema on his skin, no arthritis in his hands. His blue Irish eyes, as blue as the day he closed them in 1957. I was there several months ago at the monastery. They had moved him to a new place, the sarcophagus inside the monastery some years ago after the exhumation. They moved him to a new coffin after the beatification. And I asked Brother Richard Merlin what condition he was in when they put the new coffin there. And he said, he's the same. He looks like he's sleeping, awaiting the day of resurrection. The Roman authorities that were there said that it was the most perfectly preserved remain they've ever seen. Father Solanus. I would like to offer you a kind of way to meditate upon these aspirations that Father Solanus used to recommend to people based on his last words. I mean, you can use the rosary or just use your fingers to do this, but you just say, if you get up in the morning, I give my mind to Jesus Christ, I give my heart to Jesus Christ, I give my body to Jesus Christ, I give my soul to Jesus Christ. That's everything, every capacity that our Lord has given us, that God the Father created in us. Our intellect, our will, our heart, our will, our body, our soul. We return them to God every day in the same way. We know the famous stories of Padre Pio, and I won't go into a long history. I want to tell you about Father Solanus because he's an American, and he's a great intercessor for healing, I think especially in our day. And when I went to the beatification on November the 18th past, I was there with a group of about 60 individuals from Cleveland, and I was given permission from the superior to have Mass on the altar that Father Solanus used to celebrate Mass in the monastery. And there were many people from all over the world there for the event, and this black woman came up to me. I thought she was an African American from Africa, but she was Hispanic from Panama. I didn't know who she was. She introduced herself to me, Paula Zarate. And later that afternoon at the beatification Mass, she was walking up with the friars, with Brother Richard, with Father's relic, because she was the miracle for his beatification. She had come to the monastery in 2012 with a skin disease that covered her whole body at the time she was a teenager, called ichthyosis, left the skin looking like fish scales. And she prayed at the tomb of Father Solanus. And after having taken a nap, as she was getting up from her nap, the scales started falling off of her skin, revealing healthy skin underneath. And confirmed by doctors back and forth in the United States and in Panama, the Church accepted her as a miracle for his beatification. Many women go to that grave who are unable to conceive and are able to conceive children after a visit to Father Solanus' grave. The friars in Detroit could tell you it's one of the most common miracles. Maybe it's because he was one of 16 children. He had special concern for mothers and children. But many women are able to conceive after visiting his grave. Couples go there to propose marriage at his grave on a regular basis. You see them in Detroit. Constant graces. In a time when Catholic marriages are dissipating 60,000 a year for the last 20 years, he's even bringing couples together in holy matrimony in his death. Padre Pio, who we know famously guided the spiritual children, he gave 5 points for growing in the spiritual life, similar to the ones that Father Solanus gave. He said, daily Mass, not Sunday Mass, daily Mass, daily presence at the Eucharist, weekly confession, meditation, as Father Solanus said, quiet mental prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament if you're able, spiritual reading, read good spiritual books. Our lives are so filled with the trash of modern culture that we're constantly inundated by some kind of a screen and things that rot away at our brain. He said, read good spiritual books. And then finally he said, examine your conscience twice a day. In the morning, as an act of gratitude for the gift of life, and at night as a review of the day. Examine your conscience twice a day, he said, for growth in spiritual life. Now we know that Padre Pio had the stigmata on his body for 50 years. St. Francis had it for 2 years and 2 days. But just before he died in 1968, it is said to have disappeared. You know, Padre Pio could have been a bitter man as well, because one of the most famous scientists and also medical doctor at the time, who was a Catholic priest, his name was Gemelli. He was a Franciscan. There's a famous hospital in Rome named after him. He said that Padre Pio, he told Pope Pius XI, was the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on the Catholic Church. And because Gemelli was close to the Pope, this got Padre Pio removed from public ministry for a period of years back in the 20s and 30s. Padre Pio accepted the humiliation gracefully and with obedience. He knew the truth, and eventually he was restored. They sent doctors down to San Giovanni Rotondo and wrapped his hands with special gloves, put a wax seal, and left him for 6 to 8 weeks. They came back, the wounds on his hands just as fresh as they had been. Padre Pio bled about a cup of blood a day, but the wounds never got infected and never healed over. But when he died, they disappeared almost miraculously as they had appeared in 1918. Also adding to the veracity of the wounds, of the truth of them, because had he been injuring himself, which was the accusation originally, there would have at least been scars on his skin. And it said that when he died, the skin was as fresh as the day he was born. There was no sign of any wound there. They said for a brief time, the wound on his side had a red line, like someone took a red pencil and drew on his side, and that disappeared as well. There was nothing left. Padre Pio, when he would be asked which of the wounds was the most painful, he would always say, the wound on the shoulder. People that really knew Padre Pio knew that. The wound on his shoulder, and carrying the burden. Padre Pio did that for countless souls. 18 hours a day he would spend in the confessional, freeing souls from patterns of sin in their life. And he did it in a marvelous way. Famous story of a young man who went to Padre Pio and couldn't remember all the sins that Padre Pio told him every venial and mortal sin that he ever committed in his life. And the young man said, I spent the rest of the afternoon in the chapel drenching the floor with my tears. They said, I left that chapel a new man. Padre Pio was not a cruel confessor. He was a good confessor. Sometimes people would come to him who were not sincere, who were not sorry. Journalists who just wanted an interview with him. And he would quickly dispatch them, sometimes in an abrupt manner. But he never made a cruel comment or gesture to anyone. He was serious about the salvation of souls, and he didn't have time for people who weren't. He was a serious individual, but he was also a man of great joy. He was also, as a friar can tell you in Italy, a practical joker. There was a famous story of Padre Pio. A doctor came into the monastery to give injections to the friars, and one of the young friars was deathly afraid of the shot. And so Padre Pio spoke to his classmate who was sitting next to him and said, now, when you go in the doctor's office, make a huge scream. So he went in, they closed the door, he let out this blood-curdling scream, and the other friar fell to the floor, fainted over, because of the shock of having to go next. He loved to tease that other friar about how difficult it was when he entered the order. The sign of a true holy person is also a sign of a gracious and joyful heart. Serious-minded, focused on God, but patient with others, and especially patient with their sinfulness. He didn't have time for people who weren't sincere, but he would help people make a sincere confession. And that is the goal of a parish mission, to bring our sins to God in a confident and serious way. The goal of the Lenten season is not just to give up candy or some other amusements and then to resume them, maybe you do that with children to begin to train them about what it means to give up things. That's a good thing to do with children. But the primary purpose of the Lenten season is to overcome vice, sinful patterns in our lives, to look at our primary fault once again and see how we might best address it. So to chip away at it, and so that we choose to lay aside things that are related to our primary fault. If anger is our primary fault, we develop patterns to counter the anger. Padre Pio's last words on earth were just the holy names of Jesus and Mary. In fact, in his very last breath, he uttered the word Maria. And one can just simply take those beautiful holy names and use them as an aspiration to begin to overcome the patterns of sin in our own lives. So that if we're tempted, if we become provoked by some situation with another person, we just simply say in our heart, Jesus, help me. Mary, help me. It's a way of allowing forgiveness to come from the heart of the Father, because we're limited in our ability to have patience with others. We have limited virtue. We need to tap into a deeper spiritual resource, and that's the heart of the Father. We forgive others not from our own resources, but we forgive them from the heart of the Father. We do that when we say the holy name. Jesus, help me. Mary, help me. When we're feeling provoked or tempted. So those are the spiritual wisdom of the saints of the Franciscan tradition, conform to the cross of Christ after the pattern of their spiritual father, St. Francis of Assisi. May God give us the grace to make a good Lent. May He give us the grace to overcome our habits of sin in our lives, so that we can live